drive things off the wall.
That's us, man. 24/7.
You should expect the unexpected. I mean,
Make it known that this is all about being 100% authentic.
We are live now.
So with that being said, let's jump right in.
Let's dig right in, man. Walt, you want to go ahead and start off with any questions you have?
Yeah,
Or Mike.
I do have a lot of questions for all of you. Like Dev said, thank you so much for joining us. Is greatly appreciated. What we try to do here is we try to keep it a conversational deal. So I don't want it to feel like it's an interview. Hopefully the questions will come off more as like, casual friends just, talking, like, oh, what do you got going on? So I feel like we've gotten through to what do you got going on. So I'm especially interested to hear about your journey, Dr. Thurston, like to go from where you went, because, it's something that I think in our community is kind of our boys will be boys. Young Black males are often, diagnosed with all kinds of mental health conditions and overly medicated and underserviced a ton. And we resort to all kinds of different outlets and things to kind of cope, So you said you got through an addiction to porn and you got over the use of medication. What was that journey like as a young man? Because that's not something that a lot of our young men see. So what was that journey like as a young man, like the temptations of life? And how do you feel like that journey was different as a young man but doable as a young man?
So just want to clarify. So you're asking me how did I make it through that journey, and how did I deal with it? When it came to depression, I would say one aspect, because there are many aspects and parts of our lives, when it came to, I would say, the pornography, I actually was exposed to pornography through my dad. At a very early age, I remember my dad used to watch it, but I wasn't aware. I was in elementary, I was a kid. And, back in them days, you had VHS tapes. So I just popped in a tape thinking this is something, maybe a cartoon or whatever, and porn pops up. So that was my first exposure. So maybe the second or third exposure was middle school. Was on a computer, and I opened a drawer and there was a flick DVD in the drawer. And I didn't know who it was. Being a little naive, I'm like, I didn't think my dad was really watching it, but I'm like, man, maybe I should ask who on this is. But I took it, had a PS2 back in them days, and just went in, opened that door. Another opportunity was HBO back in those days. At night, HBO at night, the little flicks come on. And what ended up happening, I got curious of what it felt like, orgasm, and just, hey, I played with myself. And that's how I got addicted to porn. Then I had a friend that ordered some on cable TV. I just got addicted to the feeling, to the feeling of that, ejaculation and so forth. And it became hardcore. And on the real, like I tell people, I said even in my book, I became so addicted to porn I couldn't sleep at night. I used to masturbate so much I had to get prescription drugs from my primary doctor, because I was overusing my male reproductive system, my organ, my penis. It was hurting when I'm going to school because I'm doing it too much. And that was how I was in high school. I'm supposed to be doing schoolwork. Instead of doing schoolwork, I'm sitting here watching porn, downloading even off of LimeWire back in those days. And just watching it over and over and over. So it took over my life, even to the point where I was looking at my aunties and uncles wanting to have sex with them. And so, when you're not used to something and you become drowned in it and engulfed by it, it becomes a part of who you are. And so navigating it, I think the church helped me. They had an abstinence retreat, talked about some things, some men things, but even then it was just a stronghold. It just was a way of thinking. And it wasn't until years later, where I really just gave my heart and life to God. In that process, but even as a grown man, 32 years old, you can be free from something, but if you don't have discipline, if you don't have or maintenance, you just don't maintain. Like I say all the time, freedom must be maintained. It's not enough to have freedom in any capacity that it's in. You got to maintain freedom. It's like weight loss. You can lose 20 pounds, but you can get it back if you don't maintain it or discipline. So anything that we have must be maintained. And so even now, I have to protect myself from my old self. I have, and I mean, coming from what I used to be to who I am now, I couldn't say no, but now I can say no because of God, the Holy Spirit. But even in those moments, I have to keep my mind clear. I have to protect my mind, protect myself. I have a app on my phone, my laptop called Covenant Eyes, because if I get low, we can all revert back to that old us. When stress comes, we used to self-medicate. That was my self-medication. Some people used to be drugs or alcohol or the casino. It doesn't matter what it is or what it was. When we have stress, that's the first thing we go to. And so I had to protect myself from falling. And so I think the process for that particular area was very needed. And then also having a counselor that understands, that sees where I'm at, and willing to hold me accountable as well, in that particular area. But as far as the mental health, um, I believe church plays about, or spirituality, but definitely counseling and mentorship. I think mentorship, one thing I lacked the most was a mentorship and someone to really listen to me, to understand me, not listen to just respond. And I think that was one of the catalysts to why I even got caught up in witchcraft. Because sometimes as a young person, we're talking to an adult, but they're not really listening to us. They're just listening to respond and give us an answer. You can't just give us an answer. You got to hear what we're really saying and hear us, to not even sometimes answer, but to just understand, or to at least connect. And sometimes that's the really missing link. There's no connection. And so I say that's what really is needed, and that will help a lot of young people as well.
That's amazing, brother. I mean,
Wow.
a lot of what you spoke about is, I think part of the plague of this younger generation. Technology is at their fingertips and access to all of that. Social media. I mean, social media, you basically can go on there and find porn. You don't have to wait for HBO late night. You can just go to
Yeah.
YouTube.
Yeah.
It's there. Friends are sending it to each other, in the middle of the school day. So I think they become a bit desensitized to it.
Yeah.
So that's real powerful. And if y'all don't mind, I got one more question for Dr. Thicklin. You spoke about domestic violence. And really, it kind of could be for all of you all. I've noticed a mental health shift in as a result of this pandemic. Have you, Dr. Thicklin, have any of you noticed an uptick in any sort of the conditions that you treat, especially domestic violence, as a result of the pandemic? I mean, I teach at a school where we went from, I've been there for 4 years. I think this is my fourth year there. We might have had maybe 10, maybe in my 4 years, physical altercations. We've had almost 30, in the first 30 days of school. These kids are, pent up, and they've been using social media to go back and forth. So I just wonder, like, mental health wise, have you all seen an uptick in the conditions that you service, and in particular you, Dr. Thicklin, what have you seen as far as domestic violence goes?
And feel free for all four of y'all to answer that as well.
Well, absolutely. There's been an uptick in domestic violence, and the strange thing about it, there's been an uptick of it occurring, but a downtick far as the reporting of it inside of it. One of the things that happened as a nationwide response to the pandemic was what we call safe at home. And so people were, told to stay home. Well, that wasn't really good for a person who's already a victim, because now you're locked up with your perpetrator the whole time, which also prevented them from being able to use the normal reaching out for resources because the perpetrator is there. We discovered because the perpetrator was at home, the perpetrator didn't even get to go out and do other things that would at least divert attention from it. So we've seen it happen. We've seen shelter services actually have to almost reinvent themselves in the midst of this pandemic. Many of the shelters, because of the pandemic itself, had to literally downsize themselves or put people in hotels simply because of the distancing inside of it. However, what we're seeing on this end of the pandemic with domestic violence is that it is showing itself strong. It's showing itself strong in terms of an uptick in homicide. We're seeing an uptick inside of abuse that's happening even during pregnancy. And so it is really manifesting itself because, once again, power and control. And, I posted something earlier that says that wouldn't it be great for every abuser to experience the liberation of knowing that abuse is not love and love is not abuse, if it was just that simple. But what we're seeing now is definitely an increase in domestic violence happening. And it's even coming down to the kids, as you so said. They're being exposed to things, they've been locked in, they're seeing aggression happening at home, things that they could have escaped before. And for most kids now, it was like ready, set, go. When school did begin to take in, and they had to find some place to let that aggression go. And you're seeing the uptick happening in schools. I'm seeing more suspensions happening. There's a lot of things that are happening. So I think we'll look back at this time, and then somewhere in the near history, we're going to be looking at the ACEs of these kids, the adverse childhood experience, and seeing how it uptick, especially during this time in this pandemic.
I could see that changing the way ACEs are even looked at. I could see them needing to add a new category.
Absolutely.
How does COVID become its own adverse childhood experience? Because this is impacting them in ways I've never thought I'd see. These kids are struggling. They're struggling big time.
Sandra, what's your take on it?
I'll tell you what my take is, and that is, as a family therapist, what I'm seeing, you can see the reports. They're burgeoning in our country today, and it's not just here in America; it's around the world because COVID-19 is a pandemic. And so, from my lens, therapeutically, 30% opiate overdose, right? Since COVID has come in. What we don't see and what a lot of people don't understand, it's much like the game Jenga. So how many of you have ever played that Jenga game, right? It's when you're putting blocks on top of blocks on top of blocks. And who is the loser? The loser is the one that puts that last piece on the top that causes everything to fall down. I'm explaining what's called the allostatic load. Dr. Thurston hit on it when he said stress, and Pastor Thicklin and Dr. Thurston both hit on this. So the allostatic load is what you're seeing. You're seeing the manifestation now with COVID-19 of what's happening when we have unresolved grief and trauma, right? And because grief and trauma is so unresolved in us, we repress, especially in the African-American community, right? Disproportionately so in the African-American community, because we have what's called transgenerational trauma, right? And because these traumas transfer from one generation to the next, we don't even know that we're walking around with what's called a trauma inheritance, right? So where other families are given inheritances of houses and land, we know that was stolen from the African-American community, where people are given inheritances of money and trust funds, the African-American community have received trauma inheritance. That's why we're calling each other the N-word so easily, see, because we have been lynched and beat and stolen from our land and so many other things, and you think it's over. But it's not. And now epigenetic studies have proven this, right? The Bible teaches us that the sins of the father goes to the third and fourth generation. Well, science is catching up with scripture because science now, and I'm talking secular scientists, have now discovered research in epigenetics and neuroscience, neurobiology that teaches us that your body holds in its cellular in the cellular capacity, It holds memories, right, of your ancestors. So you're not just walking around here as John or Jane Doe. You're walking around with your ancestors and parts of their lived experience within you. So when you see domestic violence, when you see the uptick of addiction, when you see the uptick of any STIRB, and when I say STIRB, I'm talking about a short-term energy relieving behavior that has turned into a stronghold or a full-blown addiction. That's what you're seeing. So whatever the stressor is, whatever the fear factor is, whatever that last Jenga piece at the top is for you, and that unresolved trauma for you, or that unresolved grief for you, that's what you're gonna see, that time bomb. And we've seen that time bomb in our country today. We've seen it so clearly, and it informs us as counselors exactly what we're dealing with. And we're dealing with a world where we have unresolved grief and unresolved trauma, and whatever you don't deal with will deal with you.
That's powerful. You know, Mike, before you jump into that, I just want to just say one thing, and it really touched on what you said, Sandra, in regards to not only is COVID the pandemic, but domestic violence is actually a pandemic within the COVID pandemic. Not only in the States, but in the world. In one location in particular, there is an alarming statistic that says that over 300%, there's been a 300% increase of domestic violence ever since the COVID pandemic has actually taken place. And we're seeing in other areas where we're seeing a rise of at least 25 to 50% and more. So it is a real thing. It's very alarming. And I'm glad that you touched on that, because it is something that is real. Mike stepped away. So Dr. Thurston, would you care to add to what was just mentioned?
I mean, I agree with both what Dr. Thicklin and Dr. Sandra are saying. I've even noticed it in my mentees as a mentor before the pandemic. You know, having a mentor is a very empowering moment. One of my mentees, you know, he was because I was in his life doing things with him, he was doing fairly well. The teachers noticed, the organizer noticed it. But when the pandemic hit, it's like the child they just shut down. You can hardly reach them. They don't respond the same way that they do or they did prior to. So this is a stressor. The pandemic is nothing but another stressor. And I want to say this because sometimes we become our environment, like Dr. Sandra says. My mother, when we talk about domestic violence, I've seen it in my own life as well as many of us have. My mother, she always says this story. I was never a cusser growing up. But when she married my dad was very, very verbally abusive, and so verbally abusive, my mother literally, the only way she could get peace was to cuss my dad back out. So he's cussing her out, verbally abusing her, and the only way she could get peace was to cuss back. And so some of us, we do the same thing in our lives. We become the perpetrators. We become the abusers. 70, over 76% of abusers have been abused. So we're becoming the perpetrators. So it's not just, you know, domestic violence takes two people. You know, one is initiating, the other is receiving, but they're giving it back as well. And some of us, we're in that survival mode. That survival mode within our body goes into survival mode. And so the only way some of us believe we can be free or have peace is to shoot a gun, is to snort cocaine, is to cut ourselves. That's the survival mode. So that in itself is a mental health issue, because I don't know how to get help outside of my home. And so I'm stuck home. And so what do I do now? I gotta cuss. That's the only way I get peace. I gotta slice some tires. I gotta slice myself. I gotta do something violent to get the peace that I only know how to get. And so many of us don't have those resources, or because they have the lack of resources, especially in the Black community. And African American kids are twice as likely to commit suicide than Caucasian kids. And then we are undersourced. Even some psychiatric organizations won't fund African Americans or mental health professionals because we have that pigmentation, and so we are undersourced and underprivileged. And so it's just a pandemic after a pandemic, COVID is not the only pandemic. Slavery was a pandemic all by itself. Rape is a pandemic. Sexual abuse is a pandemic. Depression, all these were just seeing the symptoms of what has really happened. It's like a tree. You can cut down the branch, you can pluck the fruit, but until you deal with the roots of that tree, it's gonna still stand. And what we want to really do is deal with the roots, like Dr. Sandra is saying and Dr. Thicklin are saying. It definitely makes a difference. The atmosphere makes a difference.
Yo, if you haven't, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and follow 5 Things Off the Wall on all platforms.